Damon was supposed to be the stepfather who protected Sophie, but behind closed doors he hid a dark secret, one that would shatter their family forever. When Laura uncovered the truth, no one could have predicted how far a mother would go to protect her daughter, even if it meant crossing the line into darkness herself. What really happened in that quiet house? The shocking story unfolds here. Laura had always believed in second chances. After surviving a messy divorce and raising her daughter alone for nearly a decade, she thought she had finally found stability when she met Damon. He was tall, calm-spoken, and dependable, everything her ex-husband hadn't been. He fixed things around the house, cooked on weekends, and even helped Sophie with her homework. Within a year, Laura and Damon married in a small backyard ceremony, with Sophie quietly standing beside her mother, wearing a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They moved into a modest two-story home in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. The neighbors waved as they unpacked boxes, birds chirped from newly trimmed trees, and the air seemed to carry a peaceful stillness. Laura finally felt like the hard years were behind her. She didn't notice the way Sophie hesitated when Damon put his hand on her shoulder, or how she stayed longer in the bathroom than usual. In Laura's eyes, things were just settling in. Sophie was 17, a quiet girl who loved to draw. Her notebooks were filled with sketches of forests, houses, and shadowy figures. She never talked much, but she had always confided in her mother. That changed after Damon moved in. Laura assumed it was just teenage mood swings, common in girls her age. She didn't see anything wrong. After all, Damon was polite, responsible, and attentive. Sometimes too attentive. He often complimented Sophie on her hair, her clothes, her smile. He started knocking on her door at odd hours, asking if she needed help with school. He bought her gifts, small things like bracelets or notebooks, and always said they were from both him and Laura. Though Laura never remembered picking them out, Sophie would accept them with a blank expression, then hide them in the back of her closet. Laura worked long shifts at the hospital. She was used to coming home to silence. On some nights, Sophie would already be in bed, her door shut tightly. On others, Damon would be sitting alone in the living room, pretending to watch TV. He always smiled and said everything was fine. There was never a reason to suspect anything, but slowly, Laura noticed small things, things that didn't add up. Sophie's grades began to slip. She stopped hanging out with her best friend Ella. She no longer sketched in the living room or laughed at the old movies she once loved. She started wearing oversized clothes and avoided hugging her mother. One evening, Laura found Sophie standing in front of her mirror, holding her shirt against her stomach with a strange, far-off look in her eyes. When asked if she was okay, Sophie just nodded and walked away. Damon, on the other hand, seemed more relaxed than ever. He whistled while making breakfast, cleaned the yard on weekends, and offered to drive Sophie to school, saying it gave them time to bond. Laura appreciated his efforts. She had no reason to question them, but behind Sophie's silence was a story no one was hearing, a story that had already started to unfold. Laura's instincts stirred once or twice, like a quiet voice in the back of her mind. But she silenced it, convincing herself she was overthinking. She didn't want to be the paranoid mother. Damon was good to them. He had helped bring stability into their lives. But behind the walls of their perfect, new home, something was wrong. Something was hiding in the quiet moments, in the locked doors, in the shifting eyes and sudden silences. It was buried beneath smiles, beneath normal routines, beneath trust, and no one, not even Laura, was ready for what was about to be revealed. Sophie's change didn't happen overnight. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first, like a shadow stretching across a room as the sun begins to set. At school, she stopped raising her hand in class. Her teachers whispered among themselves about her fading enthusiasm. At home, she retreated more and more into herself. The once bright, creative girl who filled pages with drawings now spent hours locked in her room with the curtains drawn, the light barely spilling in. Laura noticed the difference, but told herself it was just a phase. Teenage girls often went through moments like this. Sophie was quiet by nature anyway, always preferring to observe rather than participate. Still, the way she avoided Damon was harder to explain. She flinched if he tried to touch her shoulder or stand too close. Sometimes she would rush out of the house, leaving Damon and Laura behind without a word. Even Damon, who always seemed calm and in control, started to show signs of impatience. Occasionally, Laura would hear sharp, low voices from Sophie's room just before the door slammed. Other times, Damon's face would darken when Sophie refused to eat dinner with the family or left the table early. Yet, in front of Laura, he maintained the mask of a caring husband and stepfather. His polite smiles never wavered, even when Sophie's withdrawal grew worse. Ella was the only one Sophie confided in anymore. The two had been inseparable since middle school, sharing secrets, dreams, and worries. But lately, Ella noticed how Sophie's eyes seemed hollow, how her voice was softer, quieter, like she was trying to hide something deep inside. On one afternoon when the sun was dipping low behind the trees, Ella saw Sophie struggling to stay awake in class, her head nodding slightly before she jerked awake. When Ella reached out to touch her arm, Sophie recoiled as if burned. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie's condition worsened. She missed school more frequently, claiming headaches and nausea. Ella begged Sophie to tell her what was wrong, but Sophie's silence was a wall too thick to break through. One afternoon, Ella saw Sophie slipping into a small clinic near the edge of town. It was a women's health center, a place Ella had never expected Sophie to visit. Curiosity and worry pushed Ella to follow at a distance, her heart pounding as she watched Sophie enter the building alone, clutching her bag tightly. When Sophie returned, her shoulders were slumped, and she moved like a ghost. Ella tried again to ask questions, but Sophie only shook her head and whispered one chilling word, Damon. That single name sent a cold wave through Ella's mind. It was a warning and a secret all at once. Something was very wrong. At home, Sophie grew more secretive. Her phone was locked with a password she refused to share, and she deleted messages before Laura or Damon could see. The sketches in her notebook changed too. No longer were they peaceful landscapes or gentle faces. Instead, they were dark, chaotic images, twisted shadows looming over fragile figures, broken homes, and trapped birds. Each drawing seemed to cry out for help, but no one saw the signs. Laura began to feel a quiet fear creeping beneath her calm exterior. Late one night, she heard muffled sobs from Sophie's room. The sound was so soft, so full of pain, it froze Laura in place. Yet when she knocked gently, Sophie wiped her tears quickly and told her everything was fine. Laura wanted to believe her. She wanted to protect her daughter from whatever was hurting her. But that night, the seed of doubt was planted deep in her heart. Damon's behavior, once charming and helpful, started to unsettle Laura in ways she couldn't explain. He grew more controlling, questioning Sophie's friends and tracking her whereabouts. He checked her phone when Laura wasn't home, and insisted Sophie share her passwords. There were nights when Damon stayed awake long after Laura fell asleep, pacing the hallway outside Sophie's door. His eyes glinted with something unreadable, something dark. Still, Laura held on to hope that it was all a misunderstanding, that Sophie was simply going through a difficult stage. But Ella's visits became more frequent, and the whispered warnings grew louder. There was a secret in the house, a secret that Sophie couldn't speak, and that Damon was desperate to hide. The quiet tension inside their home thickened every day, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Laura's protective instincts flared, but so far, nothing concrete had emerged. The truth remained locked behind closed doors, hidden beneath Sophie's silence and Damon's carefully crafted smiles. And Laura had no idea how soon everything would come crashing down. Ella couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening to Sophie. Every time they met, Sophie seemed more fragile, like a bird with broken wings, barely able to hold herself together. Ella's concern grew into a desperate need to find out what Sophie was hiding. She tried asking questions, but Sophie always brushed her off or changed the subject. The silence between them was growing heavier, filled with things left unsaid. One afternoon, as the sky turned gray and the wind whispered through the trees, Ella made a decision. She would follow Sophie, just to see where she was going. Maybe, if she knew what Sophie was facing, she could help. She waited outside their school, watching as Sophie slipped away from the crowded hallways without a word. Sophie walked quickly, her head down, as if she was trying to disappear. Ella kept her distance, careful not to be seen. The streets around the clinic were quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hold your breath. Sophie didn't look back once. She entered the small building with a hesitant step, clutching her bag tightly. Ella hid behind a parked car, heart pounding in her chest, waiting. Minutes passed like hours. Then Sophie emerged, moving slower this time, her face pale and drawn. Ella noticed how Sophie avoided the clinic's name on the door, a women's health center, a place filled with hushed conversations and hidden fears. She wanted to call out to ask what had happened inside, but Sophie was already slipping away down the street. That night, Ella sat in her room, replaying what she had seen. She reached for her phone and nervously searched for advice about the clinic. The information she found confirmed her fears. The center helped girls with pregnancies, counseling, and medical care. Ella's stomach twisted. Could Sophie be pregnant? The thought was too heavy to hold, but she knew she couldn't keep silent. Days later, Ella found herself in Sophie's room, her heart pounding louder than ever. Sophie was sitting on the bed, staring out the window, eyes distant. Ella hesitated but then noticed a thin folded paper peeking out from the pages of Sophie's sketchbook. Without thinking, she carefully pulled it free and unfolded it. The paper was a medical report. Sophie was, indeed, pregnant. The date was recent. Ella's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the words, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Sophie anymore. Something darker hovered beneath the surface. She remembered Sophie's whispered warning, Damon. Suddenly, the pieces didn't fit together. Why would Sophie name her stepfather in such a secretive, fearful way? Ella wanted to scream the truth to Laura, but she wasn't sure how. Sophie was scared, terrified even, and Ella wasn't sure if telling her mother would help or hurt. She decided to keep the secret for a little longer, hoping Sophie would come forward on her own. But Sophie only sank deeper into silence. Her drawings grew more haunting, showing shadowy figures looming over small, fragile girls. The images felt like warnings, silent cries for help that no one seemed to hear. Sophie stopped going to school altogether, spending her days locked away, her world shrinking to the walls around her. Laura noticed the changes too. She saw Sophie's pale face, the way she held her stomach as if trying to protect something hidden inside. But whenever Laura asked, Sophie denied everything. Laura blamed stress or illness, unaware of the terrifying reality unfolding. Meanwhile, Damon's behavior shifted again. He became colder, his eyes sharper, watching Sophie with a strange intensity that made even Laura uncomfortable. He started leaving late at night and returning early in the morning, avoiding questions about where he'd been. His control tightened around Sophie like a noose. Ella's worry turned to fear. She could sense a dangerous secret lurking just beneath the surface, a secret Sophie was too scared to speak aloud, and one that Damon was determined to keep hidden. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, and she knew the quiet before the storm was only the beginning. Something was coming, something no one was ready for, and Ella feared that once the secret broke free, nothing would ever be the same again. Laura's world began to shift the day she found the journal. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, when Sophie was supposed to be at school, but instead, she was locked away in her room, the door firmly shut. Laura had tried knocking, but there was no answer, only a heavy silence that seemed to fill the whole house. Her heart ached with a mother's worry. She knew something was wrong, though Sophie wouldn't say what. As Laura paced the living room, eyes caught on the corner of Sophie's sketchbook peeking out from under a pile of clothes on the bed. It wasn't unusual for Sophie to hide her drawings in odd places, but this time something made Laura curious. She picked up the notebook carefully and flipped through the pages. The drawings were darker than before, twisted, haunting images of shadows trapping small figures and broken homes. One page was folded inside, tucked between the sketches, like a secret waiting to be uncovered. Laura unfolded the paper slowly. It was a medical report confirming Sophie's pregnancy. The room seemed to grow colder as she read, the words sinking deep into her chest. Her hands trembled as she noticed the date, a few weeks old, and her mind raced. How had she missed this? Why hadn't Sophie told her? The answer was there in the pages she hadn't yet seen. She found the journal, a small worn book, with Sophie's name written in faint ink. Laura hesitated before opening it, knowing that inside would be Sophie's most private thoughts. Page after page revealed a story Laura had never imagined. Sophie wrote about fear, shame, and confusion. She spoke of Damon, not as the caring stepfather Laura believed him to be, but as someone who was controlling and cruel. Sophie described secret threats, times Damon had cornered her in her room, whispered things that chilled her to the bone, and how she felt trapped with no one to turn to. The journal was a cry for help from a girl caught in a nightmare. Laura's calm shattered. A storm of emotions crashed through her, shock, anger, disbelief. How could the man she trusted be hurting her daughter? The man she had welcomed into their lives. But beneath it all, a cold, hard resolve began to grow. She would protect Sophie, no matter what. For hours, Laura sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, reading every word, piecing together the hidden parts of their lives. The fear Sophie had tried to hide was real. The silence was not rebellion, but a shield. Laura's heart broke with every line, but she kept reading, knowing this was the key to saving her daughter. When Sophie returned home that evening, Laura waited. She didn't say a word about the journal, or the report, or the terrible truth she had learned. Instead, she watched her daughter closely. The way Sophie held herself, the shadows under her eyes, the way she flinched when Damon called her name. Laura's mind was already racing, planning the next steps, but for now she needed to keep the peace. That night, as the house grew quiet, Laura lay awake, thinking about what she had uncovered. The man she had married was not who she thought he was. Damon's charm was a mask, hiding a dark secret. She remembered the nights he paced outside Sophie's door, the moments Sophie tried to disappear, and the silent phone calls Laura had dismissed. But now everything fit together like pieces of a broken puzzle. The whispers, the threats, the strange gifts Sophie never wanted to show. Laura saw them all clearly. The image of Damon changed from protector to predator in her mind. And with that change came a fierce determination. Laura knew she had to act. She couldn't let Damon continue to hurt Sophie. But she also knew this wouldn't be easy. Damon was clever and dangerous. He had built a facade of kindness, and beneath it, a web of control that kept Sophie silent. As Laura planned her next moves, the house felt different, thicker, heavier. The shadows seemed to stretch longer. The quiet was no longer peaceful, it was filled with tension. The secret Sophie had carried for so long was finally uncovered, but the danger had only just begun. Laura's calm exterior was cracking, replaced by a steely edge. She would protect her daughter at any cost. And soon, the truth would no longer be hidden behind locked doors and silent tears. It would be brought into the light, no matter the price. Laura's mind raced with the knowledge she had uncovered, but she knew acting impulsively would only put Sophie in more danger. She couldn't confront Damon outright. He was unpredictable, and any show of anger might push him further into silence or worse. Instead, Laura chose a quiet, calculated approach. Every move had to be precise, every moment watched. Days turned into weeks, as Laura played the role of the devoted wife and concerned mother. She smiled at Damon, cooked his favorite meals, and kept the house spotless. To the outside world, their family looked normal, happy even. But beneath the surface, Laura's eyes never stopped observing. She watched Damon's routines, his habits, the way he moved through the house with a quiet confidence that made her skin crawl. She began keeping notes, Small details Damon thought she wouldn't notice. How he checked Sophie's phone when Laura was at work. The way he demanded Sophie share passwords. His late-night phone calls with no explanation. The cold look in his eyes whenever Sophie spoke out of turn. These weren't the behaviors of a caring stepfather, they were signs of control and fear. At the hospital where she worked as a nurse, Laura started gathering information. She knew Damon's medical knowledge was limited, but she found ways to collect sedatives and painkillers without raising suspicion. She kept them hidden in a locked box, her mind already planning how she might use them if the time came. The thought was chilling, but Laura convinced herself it was necessary. She had to be ready. Laura also reached out to Ella discreetly, sensing that the girl held pieces of Sophie's world that Damon might not know about. Their conversations were brief and coded, but each one gave Laura more insight into Sophie's fears and the pressure Damon placed on her. Ella's warnings became a silent alarm, pushing Laura to act sooner rather than later. One evening, Laura watched Damon closely as he fixed dinner. He was humming softly, pretending everything was fine, but his eyes betrayed him. When Sophie refused to eat, Damon's face hardened, his smile vanishing like mist. Laura felt a cold anger rise inside her, a fury so deep it shocked her. She knew Damon had to be stopped, but how? She started planning carefully. Laura took mental notes of Damon's comings and goings, memorizing when he left the house and when he returned. She watched his car, noticed his patterns, and learned the little things that made his routine predictable. If she was going to confront this nightmare, she needed to control the moment. Laura stopped telling Sophie to just be patient. She stopped pretending everything was normal. In her heart, storm was gathering. But to Damon she remained the calm, obedient wife, always smiling, always compliant. He didn't suspect the careful plotting going on behind her steady gaze. At night, Laura lay awake, imagining the moment she would act. She pictured Damon helpless, the poison taking effect silently, quickly, without pain or struggle. Sophie would be free. Laura could finally protect her daughter. The thought gave her both hope and dread. Yet beneath the careful planning, a nagging fear stayed with her. What if she was wrong? What if Damon discovered her intentions before she was ready? The tension twisted tighter each day. The house was no longer a home, but a battlefield, and Laura was trapped inside with a dangerous enemy. Still, she reminded herself that Sophie's safety came first. She couldn't wait for Damon to strike again. The time for silence had ended. Laura's patience was gone. The next move was hers, and when it came, it would change everything. The night Laura chose was dark and thick with an almost unnatural stillness. The kind of night where shadows crawl along walls and the wind holds its breath. She had spent weeks watching, waiting for the perfect moment, a moment when Damon would be alone, vulnerable and unaware. Tonight felt like that moment. Damon had left earlier than usual, a rare thing, and Laura knew he wouldn't return until well past midnight. Sophie was asleep upstairs, her breathing steady but fragile. Laura's hands trembled as she prepared the small dose of sedative, hidden carefully in a glass of Damon's favorite whiskey. Every detail mattered. If Damon refused the drink, or sensed something was wrong, the plan would collapse, and everything would be lost. Laura waited in the dim kitchen, the only light coming from the soft glow of a single lamp. Her mind replayed every possible outcome, every risk. She wasn't a criminal, but tonight she would become one, if it meant saving Sophie. When Damon finally stepped through the door, the house seemed to hold its breath. He smiled, tired but satisfied, unaware of the danger waiting for him. Laura greeted him with a warmth she didn't feel, poured the whiskey, and handed him the glass with a steady hand. Damon took the drink without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Laura's. There was a flicker of something, curiosity, suspicion, but it vanished as he took a slow sip. Laura forced herself to stay calm, watching as the glass emptied. Minutes passed in silence. Damon leaned back in his chair, the effects slow but creeping. His eyelids fluttered, his movements less sure. Laura's heart pounded. This was working. The man who had controlled her daughter's life was slipping away into unconsciousness. She moved quickly but quietly, locking the front door and gathering her phone, car keys, and a small bag with essentials. Tonight, she was going to do what had to be done. She would take Sophie and leave, far from this house, filled with shadows and secrets. But just as Laura was about to slip out, a sound froze her blood, a low creak from the stairs. Sophie's door was opening. For a moment, Laura's breath caught in her throat. Had Sophie woken? Had Damon stirred earlier than expected? The house felt impossibly still. Then Sophie appeared in the hallway, pale and shaking, her eyes wide with fear. She had been listening. Laura's heart broke, but she steeled herself. This was their chance. She whispered to Sophie to pack a small bag and get ready to leave. Sophie nodded, her silence louder than any words. As they moved through the house, Laura kept glancing at Damon, now slumped in the chair, deeply asleep. But then, the unexpected happened. Damon's hand twitched, a faint groan escaped his lips. He was waking up, earlier than Laura planned. Panic surged through her. She hurried Sophie out the front door and locked it behind them, running to the car parked just down the street. The engine roared to life as they sped away from the house, the dark windows behind them hiding the nightmare they were fleeing. For a while the road was empty and quiet. The only sound, the soft hum of the engine and Sophie's uneven breathing. Laura reached over and gently squeezed her daughter's hand, silently promising protection, safety, and a new start. But the relief was short-lived. Moments later, Laura's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Her stomach twisted as she read the chilling words, "You can't run. He's watching." Fear exploded in her chest. Damon was not just a man. They had underestimated the danger he posed. Someone was keeping tabs on them, someone who wanted to make sure the secret stayed buried. Laura's hands shook as she locked the phone and stared out into the darkness. The night was no longer safe. The shadows that followed them were closing in, and the nightmare was far from over. But Laura was determined. No matter what, she would fight to protect Sophie, even if it meant facing a darkness deeper and more terrifying than she ever imagined. The next days felt like walking through a nightmare coated in glass. Everything was sharp, fragile, and threatening to shatter with the slightest wrong move. Laura and Sophie were no longer just running. They were hiding, constantly looking over their shoulders, unsure who they could trust or where danger might strike next. The small motel room they rented was a fragile sanctuary, but even its thin walls seemed to close in, suffocating with silence and dread. Sophie barely spoke, her eyes wide and haunted, as if the fear had taken permanent residence inside her. Laura did her best to keep up appearances, offering smiles, preparing simple meals, and trying to rebuild a fragile sense of safety. But the truth was, neither of them could escape the shadow that followed. Laura's phone was her lifeline, and her curse, the threatening message, "You can't run, he's watching," was just the beginning. Calls from unknown numbers came at all hours, silent or filled with heavy breathing. Laura didn't answer anymore. But the dread in every buzz felt like a ticking bomb beneath her skin. She knew they had been found. Desperation pushed Laura to reach out to an old colleague in the police force, someone she trusted to be discreet. The officer listened quietly as Laura explained the situation without naming names, hinting only at abuse, control, and the fear that had forced them into hiding. There was sympathy, but also caution. Without concrete proof, the law had limited power. They needed evidence. Laura's mind raced. How could she prove what Damon had done? The journal, the medical report, Sophie's secret fears, but none of that was enough without witnesses or clear evidence. The threat of Damon's reach was real and dangerous. One afternoon, while Laura was at the grocery store, Sophie slipped out of the motel. Panic surged through Laura as she called her name, but Sophie was already down the street, moving with a strange determination. Laura chased after her, heart hammering, until she caught up near a small park. Sophie's eyes were fierce, but broken. She pulled a crumpled envelope from her pocket. a bundle of photos and messages she had secretly saved on her phone. There were pictures of Damon meeting with a man in a shadowy parking lot, text messages filled with threats and demands. Sophie had been collecting proof in silence. For the first time, Sophie spoke of the darkest moments, how Damon had manipulated her, controlled her, and forced her into silence. She described a hidden phone, a secret room in the basement filled with surveillance equipment, cameras watching every corner of the house. Damon wasn't just a predator, he was a master of control. Laura's blood ran cold. The nightmare was deeper than she imagined. Damon had built a prison with walls made of technology and fear. The photos were evidence, but dangerous evidence. If they fell into the wrong hands, Damon would know. That night, as Laura locked the motel door behind them, she felt eyes watching from the shadows. A car parked across the street, its engine off, the faint outline of a man sitting inside. The chilling realization hit: they were not safe anywhere. Laura's resolve hardened. They couldn't run forever. They had to fight, but carefully. Using the evidence Sophie had gathered, Laura arranged a secret meeting with the police officer. The plan was risky: bait Damon into a trap without tipping him off. Days later, under the cover of darkness, Laura and Sophie arrived at a safe house prepared by the police. Cameras monitored every entrance. Officers waited in silence, ready to act. But Damon was clever. The tension was unbearable as they waited. Then a phone rang, an anonymous call to police, tipping them off about the meeting. Damon knew the trap was sprung too early. Suddenly, the safe house was surrounded. Damon's men moved in the shadows, silent and threatening. Laura's heart pounded. Everything was unraveling. In that moment, Laura understood the terrifying truth. Damon's power was not just over Sophie, but over everyone connected to them. The nightmare was far from over. The fight for freedom had only just begun. The night exploded into chaos faster than Laura could breathe. The quiet around the safe house shattered with the sound of pounding footsteps and harsh whispers in the dark. Police officers scrambled to their positions, radios crackling with tension. Laura's grip tightened on Sophie's trembling hand as they both huddled near the window, watching shadows move like ghosts against the walls. Outside, the silhouettes of men slipped through the night like predators, quiet but deadly. Damon's reach was longer and darker than anyone had dared imagine. The plan had been meticulous, precise, but now it was crumbling in front of their eyes. Laura's mind raced as she searched for a way out. Escape was impossible. Every exit was blocked. The safe house, meant to be a fortress, had become a cage. Sophie pressed close, her face pale but resolute, eyes locked on her mother. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house as the front door splintered under a battering ram. The intruders moved in, ruthless and swift. Officers shouted orders, but the attackers were prepared, pushing forward with a brutal determination. Laura's heart hammered. This was no longer just about survival. It was a fight for justice, for the truth that had been buried too long. She glanced at Sophie, seeing both fear and a fierce spark of courage that gave her strength. Through the chaos, a familiar voice rang out. Damon's. He stepped into the room, cold and controlled, his eyes dark with fury and menace. The man who had haunted their lives for months now stood before them, unmasked and dangerous. Laura's voice trembled as she confronted him, accusing him of everything hidden behind lies and silence. Damon smiled, a cruel, chilling smile, and suddenly the room seemed to freeze. He spoke of power, of secrets no one would believe, and threats veiled in promises. But then something unexpected happened. The police officer Laura had confided in stepped forward, holding a small recorder. It was Sophie's voice on the tape, raw and trembling as she described the abuse, the control and the fear. The evidence was undeniable. Damon's mask cracked. Anger flared in his eyes as he lunged toward the officer, but before he could reach her, several officers restrained him. The man who had once seemed untouchable was finally caught. As Damon was led away in handcuffs, The weight of months lifted from Laura and Sophie's shoulders, but the scars remained, deep, invisible wounds that would take time to heal. The nightmare was over, but the journey to recovery was just beginning. In the quiet that followed, Laura held Sophie close, promising protection and a new life built on truth and safety. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with hope. The story of betrayal, courage, and survival had come to an end, but its lessons would echo far beyond the walls of their broken home. And as the sun rose, Laura knew one thing for certain: no shadow was too dark to be chased away by the light.